Breaking news out of Volusia County. We've been showing you severe erosion in Wilbur by the sea, and a home has collapsed into the ocean there.
The first reports began quietly, surfacing late in the evening when emergency alerts rolled across Florida's coastal communities. Residents living along Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale, Daytona, Tampa Bay, and countless smaller stretches of sand received an abrupt message that would change their routines instantly. Every public beach in the state was being closed immediately under federal order. What triggered this dramatic measure was not a hurricane, nor a red tide, nor even the rise of a tropical storm. Instead, it was the detection of a massive underwater crack, a geological anomaly so unusual and concerning that federal officials felt compelled to act with unprecedented speed. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The closure was not gradual. Patrols swept through shorelines as state police, Coast Guard personnel, and county law enforcement units enforced the decision. Access points were barricaded, parking lots were blocked, tourists, many of them lounging beneath umbrellas with coolers of drinks and sunscreen smeared across their faces, were told to pack up and leave immediately. The shock rippled through Florida's most vital economic and cultural heart, as beaches are not only leisure grounds, but also an essential engine of tourism, commerce, and local identity. Scientists had long warned of Florida's vulnerability to geological shifts beneath its porous limestone foundation. The peninsula rests atop a network of caverns, underground rivers, and shifting carbonate layers that stretch beneath both land and sea. What made this event different was the scale of the fracture and its sudden detection. Specialized sonar equipment, used routinely to monitor coastal stability, picked up a deep fissure running along the seabed miles offshore. The crack was not a minor feature, but a lengthy rupture cutting across part of the continental shelf, large enough that experts feared it could alter water pressures, currents, and possibly even trigger collapses of sections of the seafloor. Closing the beaches was less about the immediate threat of waves or visible damage, and more about preventing the unthinkable. A crack of that size suggested instability that might produce sinkholes, coastal collapses, or powerful shifts in the seabed that could disturb tides. Even if no dramatic event occurred within hours or days, the risks were too great to allow millions of people to continue swimming, surfing, or sunbathing above such a hidden fault line. The immediate implications were staggering. Florida's coastline is nearly synonymous with its identity. Miami Beach alone draws millions of international visitors each year, while smaller towns rely almost entirely on seasonal beachgoers to sustain restaurants, shops, and hotels. By ordering the closure, the government was essentially shutting off the state's primary source of economic lifeblood. Airports full of arriving passengers suddenly faced confusion, with travelers diverted from their original plans. Cruise ships altered itineraries, skipping Florida's coastal stops. Families who had saved for years to enjoy vacations on the Atlantic or Gulf suddenly found themselves barred from the sands. Beyond economics, there was the emotional shock. Florida's beaches are woven into daily life for locals. Morning joggers along the surf, retirees walking their dogs, fishermen casting lines from piers, and children building sandcastles all saw their ordinary rituals severed. For generations, residents have lived with storms, hurricanes, and algae blooms as interruptions, but never had they seen every beach declared off-limits all at once. The ocean, once a familiar neighbor, was suddenly a forbidden zone. Behind the closure stood an urgent scientific scramble. Geologists, oceanographers, and federal disaster experts converged on Florida to study the fracture. Their instruments measured shifts in pressure, tremors, and the release of gas bubbles from beneath the seabed. A crack of this kind raised questions not only of erosion, but of tectonic activity. Although Florida lies far from major fault zones like California, the seafloor itself is dynamic. Underwater landslides, methane releases, and collapses of carbonate shelves are known to occur. Any of these could trigger sudden tsunamis or destabilize coastlines. The detection of a fissure stretching across such a wide area was a rare and unsettling discovery, reminding both scientists and the public that the ground beneath the ocean is far from inert. Officials emphasized caution rather than panic, yet the images spoke for themselves. Aerial drones filmed dark lines beneath the water, subtle shifts visible in sonar scans released to the press. The fracture seemed to run like a scar across the seabed, invisible to swimmers above, but menacing in its potential. Researchers explained that a sudden widening could allow seawater to rush into subterranean voids, potentially causing collapses that would send walls of water surging toward the shore. Even a partial destabilization could alter tidal flows, reshape sandbars, or disrupt marine ecosystems dependent on delicate balances of pressure and current. Communities inland, though not directly affected, began bracing for ripple effects. With the beaches closed, hotels expected mass cancellations. Small businesses predicted losses. Schools and community centers prepared to absorb crowds of children who would normally spend afternoons near the surf. Local officials coordinated with state agencies to provide temporary programs and diversions, but nothing could replace the centrality of the beaches in Florida life. Tourists, meanwhile, flooded airports and highways, seeking either refunds or alternative destinations. Some tried to salvage trips by heading inland to theme parks, springs, or cultural sites, but the disappointment was palpable. News outlets captured footage of confused travelers dragging luggage away from shuttered resorts, their plans undone by an unseen geological shift beneath the ocean. The military also took an interest, dispatching Navy units to monitor the waters. Underwater fractures could influence not only civilian safety, but also shipping lanes and naval operations. The Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic coast are both critical to national security and trade, and any disruption in seabed stability could complicate navigation, ports, and offshore drilling platforms. The Navy's advanced submarines and sonar equipment provided some of the clearest images of the crack, helping scientists map its length and depth in real time. For residents, the psychological impact ran deeper than inconvenience. Florida has always lived in the shadow of natural forces, with hurricanes carving their way across the state, sinkholes swallowing streets, and rising seas threatening coastlines. The crack added a new dimension to these fears, the idea that the very foundation of their world was unstable. Beaches had been sanctuaries, spaces of calm and freedom. To see them suddenly labeled off-limits under federal command struck at a sense of security. Environmentalists raised immediate questions about what the crack meant for marine life. Florida's reefs, already under stress from warming waters and pollution, now faced potential upheaval from structural shifts in the seabed. Fish migration routes, turtle nesting grounds, and fragile coral ecosystems could all be disrupted if the fracture widened or altered underwater currents. Even if human access was restricted, the ocean's creatures were already living with the consequences of a changing landscape. In towns from Jacksonville to Key West, locals gathered to discuss what it all meant. Coffee shops buzzed with speculation. Some wondered if the closure would last days or months. Others worried about property values along beachfront homes suddenly deprived of their most essential amenity. Rumors circulated of possible evacuations, though officials stopped short of suggesting any such move. The uncertainty only heightened anxiety, as people imagined scenarios from minor collapses to catastrophic coastal shifts. What made the situation particularly unnerving was its open-endedness. Hurricanes have forecasts and timelines. Red tide blooms eventually dissipate, but a geological fracture was not bound to a predictable cycle. It could remain stable for years or worsen overnight. This ambiguity left residents and officials alike grappling with the unknown. Planning became nearly impossible, as no one could say whether beaches would reopen soon or remain off-limits indefinitely. Scientists stressed that their work had only just begun. Mapping a fracture of such magnitude required time, coordination, and resources. They described deploying autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sensors, cameras, and drilling equipment to analyze the composition of the seabed around the crack. Their goal was to determine whether the fracture was superficial, a surface-level scar in the limestone, or something deeper tied to larger tectonic movements. Either scenario carried consequences, but the latter could imply ongoing instability across a much wider region. The event also drew international attention. Geological institutes from Europe and Asia offered assistance, eager to study the crack as a rare natural laboratory. Satellite agencies adjusted their monitoring equipment to track changes from above, while news outlets from across the globe sent correspondents to Florida's shores. Images of empty beaches, once bustling with swimmers and surfers, became symbols of a broader fragility beneath human activity. Amid the research and analysis, the federal order remained clear. Beaches were closed until further notice. Signs, fences, and patrols underscored the seriousness of the measure. It was not a symbolic act, but a direct attempt to safeguard lives from an invisible threat. Residents could still glimpse the ocean, smell its salt on the air, and hear its waves crash. But they could not step onto the sand that had defined their lives. For many Floridians, this moment became one of reckoning. The crack was not just a geological feature. It was a reminder of how precarious human existence can be when built upon dynamic natural systems. Beaches had always been seen as eternal, unchanging spaces where waves repeated their timeless rhythm. The discovery of a rupture beneath them shattered that illusion. The ground could shift, seas could rise, and life could be transformed without warning. What unfolds next lies not in aftermath, but in the ongoing tension of discovery. The beaches remain silent, closed by decree, while scientists probe the depths for answers. Florida's identity, economy, and daily rhythms hang in suspension, tethered to the mystery of a crack hidden beneath the waves. The closure of Florida's beaches following the discovery of the underwater crack transformed a familiar landscape into a forbidden frontier, and while the decision was framed as a precautionary measure, its broader implications reach deep into nearly every dimension of life in the state. With the coastline sealed off, attention shifted not only to the crack itself, but to the layers of history, culture, and meaning that Florida's shores carry with them. These beaches are not simply stretches of sand. They are places where entire communities trace their stories and where generations have come to find both livelihood and solace. One of the most striking aspects of the shutdown was how it illuminated the fragile intersection between nature and human reliance. Florida has built much of its modern identity on the promise of endless sunshine and accessible ocean fronts. From the pastel-colored Art Deco buildings of Miami Beach to the sleepy fishing towns along the Gulf, the beaches serve as a connective tissue binding disparate communities under a shared symbol of openness. With that symbol suddenly taken away, people were forced to confront just how dependent their rhythms had become on these spaces. The closure underscored that Florida is not simply near the ocean. It exists because of it, shaped by the geological processes that created its barrier islands, dunes, and shallow shelves. The fracture revealed that those very processes, still active beneath the waves, are not finished sculpting the state. For coastal scientists, the crack represented a rare opportunity to revisit Florida's deep past. Beneath the familiar sands lies a record of the ice ages when lower sea levels exposed much more land, and rivers carved through what is now submerged terrain. Caves and sinkholes dotting the peninsula tell stories of ancient water tables rising and falling, and fossils pulled from offshore beds remind researchers that Florida was once a savanna roamed by mammoths and giant sloths. The discovery of a fissure across the seabed fed into this larger narrative. Florida is a landscape always in transition, one where stone dissolves under water pressure and land shifts beneath the weight of time. The crack was not simply a modern problem, but a reminder of a continuum that stretches back millions of years. Cultural institutions also found themselves grappling with the implications. Museums and universities quickly organized forums, inviting experts to explain what was known and what remained uncertain. Historians noted that Florida's coasts have always carried a mystique of danger and allure. Spanish explorers wrote of treacherous reefs and shifting sands. Indigenous communities understood the fluid nature of the shoreline, building their lives with respect for the sea's unpredictability. The federal order shutting down all beaches thus echoed through history as the latest chapter in humanity's attempt to negotiate with an ocean that never stands still. Communities further inland, though physically removed from the shoreline, discovered how much of their own prosperity and identity was tied to the coasts. Orlando, famous for its theme parks, has long benefited from tourists combining visits to the beaches with trips inland. The sudden cutoff meant that entire chains of interconnected industries, rental cars, hotels, restaurants, entertainment complexes felt the shock. The beaches were not isolated assets, but the anchors around which Florida's broader tourism network revolved. Without them, even attractions many miles from the ocean found themselves destabilized. The crack also triggered a wave of spiritual and philosophical reflection. For many residents, the ocean is not only a place of recreation, but a space of contemplation. Sunrise rituals, yoga sessions on the sand, religious ceremonies by the shore all rely on access to the coast as a sacred meeting point between land and water. To lose that access was to lose a stage for personal and communal meaning. Faith leaders across denominations spoke of the closure as both a test and an opportunity to rediscover resilience. Some drew parallels with biblical floods, others with cycles of renewal in indigenous traditions. The crack beneath the waves became a symbol of how human beings live always at the edge of forces greater than themselves. Meanwhile, scientists intensified their efforts with a rigor that bordered on urgency. The crack was mapped with lasers and sonar, and core samples were pulled from the seabed to analyze the mineral composition. The results painted a picture of stress points in the limestone bedrock, places where water had eroded cavities that eventually collapsed into long ruptures. Though tectonic activity is relatively quiet in Florida compared to other parts of the world, the immense pressure of water, combined with subtle shifts in sea levels and sediment weight, created the perfect conditions for fractures. Each reading brought more questions. Was this crack unique, or part of a hidden network stretching beyond detection? Could similar fissures already be forming elsewhere along the continental shelf? If one rupture could trigger a shutdown of an entire state's coast, what would a series of them mean for the eastern seaboard? International observers watched closely because the implications extended beyond Florida, such as parts of the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and even stretches of Southeast Asia could face similar vulnerabilities. The Florida crack became a case study for global coastal management, a real-time scenario forcing governments worldwide to consider how fragile the interface between land and sea truly is. Researchers from Japan, accustomed to living with seismic uncertainty, expressed particular interest in comparing notes. The event was not a local anomaly, but a window into planetary processes affecting millions who live near coastlines. Amid this scientific and cultural reckoning, the social atmosphere in Florida grew heavy with a peculiar mix of frustration and awe. People accustomed to spontaneous beach outings felt confined. Coastal roads, usually clogged with vehicles carrying surfboards and coolers, now seemed eerily quiet. Businesses tried to adapt, offering inland alternatives such as kayaking on rivers or promoting springs as natural retreats. Yet none could fully substitute for the raw expanse of the ocean front. The sight of empty beaches, patrolled and guarded, stood as a visual reminder of vulnerability. It was as if the curtain had been drawn on the stage where much of Florida's public life unfolded. Artists and writers began to interpret the closure through creative lenses. Painters rendered the beaches as ghostly landscapes, empty of human figures but marked by fences and warning signs. Poets captured the tension between the eternal rhythm of the waves and the sudden prohibition of human presence. Musicians composed pieces that blended the sounds of surf with echoes of sirens, expressing the collision of natural beauty and human alarm. Cultural productions surged as people sought to process the magnitude of the moment through imagination. Education systems, too, were affected. Schools that traditionally organized field trips to coastal ecosystems had to cancel their programs. Marine biology classes that relied on first-hand observation of tidal pools or seagrass beds were left scrambling for alternatives. Teachers improvised by turning to virtual simulations, but students missed the tactile, sensory experiences of learning directly at the shore. For a generation of children, the closure represented not just an interruption, but a formative memory. The year the beaches were declared off-limits by forces beyond anyone's control. Real estate markets began to tremble under the weight of uncertainty. Beachfront properties, long considered prime investments, suddenly seemed precarious. Buyers hesitated, sellers fretted, and insurance companies reassessed risk. If an underwater crack could render the beaches unusable indefinitely, what guarantee was there for the value of homes perched on the dunes? Financial analysts debated whether the closure would lead to a short-term dip or a long-term reevaluation of coastal property. The sense of permanence that once surrounded these landscapes was shaken. The psychological dimension deepened as weeks turned into months. People reported feelings of dislocation, as though cut off from a part of themselves. For many Floridians, the beach was not simply a location, but a state of mind, a place where worries dissipated with the tide. Without that outlet, stress accumulated. Mental health professionals observed rising anxiety and organized group discussions to help residents process their unease. The crack, though unseen by most, had carved its way into the consciousness of an entire population. Even the natural rhythms of the coastline were subtly altered. With human activity withdrawn, beaches entered a period of unexpected quiet. Birds nested in areas once crowded with towels and umbrellas. Crabs scuttled freely across sand that no longer vibrated with footsteps. While people were excluded, nature reclaimed its space. Ecologists noted that the absence of human interference allowed certain ecosystems to regenerate, a reminder of how quickly the environment adapts when left alone. This raised its own dilemmas. If beaches could thrive ecologically without humans, what balance should be struck once the closure eventually lifts? Florida's identity as a global tourist hub faced its greatest test. For decades, advertising campaigns sold the state as a paradise of sun and surf. Now, with beaches barred, the image collided with reality. Tourism boards scrambled to rebrand, highlighting cultural festivals, inland parks, and urban attractions. Yet the ocean remained the unavoidable centerpiece, a magnet too powerful to replace. Without it, the promise of Florida as an unrivaled destination felt incomplete. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Florida beaches closing after the massive underwater crack? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.